Good evening. In a number of videos I've done live, I've sometimes mentioned an article I wrote some time ago in which I tried to measure, notably through a few uchronies, how many conventional wars could appear in Europe without crossing the nuclear threshold. It's an article I'd written and which I always find a little difficult to summarize orally, I realize, and so I thought that since the exercise is interesting and a number of you prefer video or at least audio listening formats to reading, well, I thought I'd simply read this article to you so that it's on the channel and I can refer to it easily. So I'm going to read it to you now by posting it here if you want to follow along. It's an article I published in my first blog, which was pretty ugly and which I kept until 2019 before switching over to the new blog, and so this article was dated September 24th, 2017, so it's a little dated, but the whole point, as you'll see, isn't that dated, apart from the fact that war has broken out in Ukraine, and perhaps I'll have a few remarks to make as I read the text, or at the end, once I've finished reading it. So the article is entitled, "What Possibilities for War and Future Movements in Europe in the Nuclear Age? A Little Historionomic Thought Experiment." For many months now, I said at the time, I recall that the Atlas des Guerres à Venir was published at the beginning of 2007, so we were in the autumn of 2007. For many months now, I've been haunted by the question of the exact nature of the wars to come, specifically in Europe, where the world's two greatest nuclear powers, potentially capable of bringing about the extermination of the human race, will be pitted against each other. In my last book, Atlas des Guerres à Venir, I pointed out that historionomics is essentially a question of relationships, especially when it comes to forecasting. Thus, the coming war in Europe must be to the Cold War what the Second World War was to the First, and what the Napoleonic Wars were to the 7 Years' War. On this blog some time ago, I explained the relationship between the two wars that mark the trajectory of vengeful imperialism, namely that the first is a war of stalemate of position and the second a war of movement. The difficulty arises when it comes to concretely considering the morphology of the second war of the Russian occurrence, of revenge imperialism today in the atomic age. Indeed, the war of stalemate of position is well suited to the age of nuclear weapons. The Cold War, after all, was nothing more than a war of position on either side of the Iron Curtain. And this, despite the fact that it was at the same time a non-war, since the armies faced each other without firing at each other because of the threat of mutually assured destruction. The question becomes far more complex when it comes to contemplating a war of movement in the nuclear age. While this form of non-war has made it possible to reconcile nuclear deterrence and war of position, it's hard to see how it could be applied to a war of movement. How could there be movement without direct combat, without forced positions, without breached lines, and therefore how could there be a war of movement when the conditions of movement, unlike those of war of position, are likely to produce a nuclear escalation and should therefore fall within the scope of deterrence? This is the paradox I've been struggling with for some time. At first I thought of this new battlefield, cyberspace, which could ultimately be the theater of a new form of war of movement, but this doesn't satisfy me, especially since it seems to me that the idea of movement must continue to be appreciated on a geographical level. I went on to try and measure how much of a war of movement could take place while remaining below the threshold of a nuclear war, and came to the initial conclusion that this would be the case with Russia's invasion of the Baltic states. Indeed, an invasion of the Baltic states, which are members of Nato, would probably provoke open warfare between Russia and all the member states of the alliance, in accordance with Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, with the attendant risk of nuclear conflict. But a study of the doctrine governing the use of nuclear weapons under Vladimir Putin's government and of the history of Russian strategic thinking over the years makes it reasonable to rule out the possibility of nuclear war. Let's not forget that Putin changed Russia's nuclear doctrine, creating some vagueness about their intentions, which led some analysts to speak of nuclear blackmail. This was notably the case during the annexation of Crimea, after which Putin explained in a propaganda report that he was ready to put nuclear forces on alert. Putin's Russia thus seems ready to employ nuclear deterrence in a new way, not to dissuade adversaries from attacking, but to cover up offensives by counting on the fact that adversaries will back down. These are things I've already had occasion to talk about. So what I mentioned in the article was what I now call offensive nuclear deterrence. Let me repeat, what I haven't explained so far is that counting on the enemy to back down after a conventional offensive under the threat of nuclear escalation is a resurgence of Soviet military thinking. In the years of nuclear war, strategic thinking went out the window. Nuclear war was an assurance of mutually assured destruction. Soviet military thinkers sought to circumvent this wall and came to the conclusion that a victorious but non-nuclear war could be fought provided only conventional forces attacked with limited strategic objectives, so that the adversary would prefer defeat by making measured strategic concessions rather than continuing the war and escalating to nuclear weapons. At the time, Soviet thinking focused on a conventional invasion limited to West Germany, which if successful would have led to the collapse of NATO. Today, the Kremlin is likely to envisage the same scenario, with West Germany being replaced by Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. The Russians know they can quickly seize the Baltic states before NATO has time to react. As an aside, of course, this is eventually called into question, along with Russia's entire conventional military capability, given what we've seen in Ukraine, but for the sake of argument, I'll continue. It's time to react. This invasion would not involve the use of nuclear weapons. Moreover, unlike the situation in West Germany in the years of the West, there is no kind of balance of effort in the region. Western analysts estimate that it would take the Russians between 3 and 5 days to take control of these three countries. The success of the first move is therefore certain, whereas 40 years ago it was uncertain. I wasn't the one who invented this. There was a report by the RAND Corporation that pointed this out, and there had been war games made that pointed in the same direction. So I'm not going to show it to you. I think we're going to have copyright problems. But there was this extract from the film Octopussy by James Bond, where General Orlov set out precisely this type of plan, i.e. that of an invasion limited to West Germany to break up NATO. I'll read it again. So today, the scenario of a Russian attack on NATO and the Baltic states would not in itself lead to nuclear war. Neither the European members of NATO nor even the United States would be ready to initiate a nuclear war in defense of the Baltic states. Putin hopes to present his allies with a fait accompli and protect himself from retaliation by annexing these territories, since Russian nuclear doctrine provides for a strike even in the event of a conventional attack on Russian territory. Here again, we have seen that this strategy was used, but for the Ukraine. With a few clarifications, however, it doesn't automatically mean the use of nuclear weapons in the event of a conventional attack. The proof is that Ukrainian forces are still advancing into territories previously conquered by the Russians and which are now Russian territories since they have been annexed. Let me remind you, because I didn't say so when I started, that it's October 13th at the end of the year. So if you like, the strategy remains the same, but we can see that this is what was foreseeable before all this began. What I said about the Baltic states applies to the logic of what's happening in Ukraine. So here goes. For their part, NATO members, specifically the Americans, are unlikely to accept the loss of the Baltic states outright, and the plausible reaction would be to concentrate troops in Poland opposite the Suwalki corridor. So here again, we're not there yet. I think that in the event of an invasion of the Baltic states, this is also what will happen. But for the moment, we're already seeing troop concentrations. In Poland, things have really started to happen. The Americans have been bringing in forces since February. We're seeing French forces in the Baltic states, Romania and elsewhere, the Americans too for that matter. So NATO's reaction was what you'd expect. You didn't have to be a genius to imagine it. Let me repeat, this is where things get complicated. While the Baltic states were obviously a limited objective, as required by Soviet military theory to avoid nuclear escalation, any advance beyond that into Poland towards Germany is an indefinite operation with consequences of a completely different order of magnitude, especially if we imagine a Russian entry into Berlin. Such uncertainty automatically brings back the risk of nuclear escalation. But yes, because at that point you're leaving the Soviet nuclear doctrine, well, the Soviet limited war doctrine, which is that you have limited objectives at the beginning. If you start to go beyond your objectives, the theory inevitably breaks down. Let me continue. Now, the war of movement, as I've theorized it through the various examples of revenge imperialism, and in particular those of Hitler and Napoleon, involves three main movements. One, the capture of the first territories, triggering open war with the Thalassocratic camp. 2. The surprise encirclement of the coalition forces breaking their backs. And 3. The capture of the capital of one of the main allies, a resounding victory for the Tellurocrat. At the time I called him a Tellurocrat rather than a vengeful imperialist. Let me repeat, this is summarized visually and for the Hitler and Napoleonic cases below. The third map shows what a strict equivalence would look like in the Putin case. So, you see, I'm leaving the text to comment on the maps. These are the maps that were in the Atlas of Future Wars, which I've reproduced here. In each case, you can see the capture of territory that leads to war with, in Napoleon's case, Austria and the United Kingdom. So with the encirclement of Ulm and then the march on Vienna, the capture of Reich territories, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Czechoslovakia and so on, and the attack on Poland, which led to war with England and France. Dunkirk and Paris were surrounded and France fell with it, and then the projection of what it would be like. Now, since this was the time of the Atlas of Future Wars, I hadn't yet written my article in 2019, which envisaged the invasion of the Ukraine, since I remind you that we are in the context of this article on September 24th of 2009-7. But in any case, even if you imagine the Ukraine being invaded, Belarus would have to be annexed, and that was no problem. And so an invasion of the Baltic states, which would definitely provoke war with the whole of Nato. And so what I imagined could be an encirclement of the forces massed opposite the Suwalki corridor, and then eventually the open road to Berlin, which is ultimately one of the capitals of the European Union. I'll read on. While stage 1 of Putin's plan, corresponding to the invasion of the Baltic states, does not pose any difficulties in the light of what I have just outlined, this is not the case for operations 2 and 3, whose realization is open to doubt. So what does this mean? Are we to assume that these stages will simply not take place and that there will simply be a Russian-Otanian confrontation on either side of the Suwalki corridor until Russian power collapses under the effect of sanctions and a military adventure in the Turkish-speaking area, which I discuss in my book? At the time I was thinking mainly of an invasion of Turkey, but today it could be Kazakhstan, with a proxy war in Kazakhstan between Russia and Turkey. Maybe I'll come back to that in a future show. Let me repeat. This possibility would correspond to the Macedonian case of vindictive imperialism with Perseus, which I've already dealt with, i.e. the low end of the Russian advance. For those who don't know, let me remind you of Perseus, of Macedonia's case of revenge imperialism during the Third Macedonian War between Rome and Macedonia. In fact, there was a small victory by Perseus at the beginning, important enough at Kallinikos, a tactical victory to make the war last longer, because it put the Romans, who had just landed, in a difficult situation, and afterwards it took them 4 years to win, whereas if they had won the first battle, they would probably have won the war in a year. So that's it. So that's the low end of the scale, because that's when revenge imperialism only achieves a measured victory at the outset, which doesn't allow it to open up a large strategic space into which it can sweep. So let me continue. And so I've already dealt with the low range of the Russian advance, and it's possible that this limited hypothesis is even more likely than I thought. For all that, the last two cases in history are indeed those of Napoleon and Hitler, and are relatively recent in Europe. The profound similarity of their course prevents us from dismissing too quickly the possibility of Putin, in the same context of modern Europe, achieving similar results. But can we envisage a scenario in which the Allies allow the Russian armies to advance as far as Berlin, or even as far as the Rhine? A very real possibility should they reach the German capital, without seriously threatening a nuclear response. Indeed, while it's doubtful that such a risk would be taken for the Baltic states alone, allowing Russia to seize Germany would be far too great a danger, almost existential for the United States and the old NATO countries of Western Europe. I'm not saying it would be completely impossible, but it's not the most likely scenario. My intention here is to get as close as possible to what things will be like, unfortunately, in attempting only to apply the pattern of previous European imperialist revanchists, and in particular the most recent, that of Germany, to modern Russia. I can go no further than this reflection. It came up with the idea of turning the problem on its head and attempting a historionomic thought experiment. Let's imagine that a time traveler goes to the year 2900 and brings the British Empire, the French Republic and the German Empire a stockpile of nuclear missiles. From there, let's try to see how, all things being equal, the German trajectory would have looked. Let's start by bearing in mind that the leaders of the time were no less cautious or crazier than they are today. Chemical weapons appeared and were used during the First World War, but their use remained limited. Subsequently, having realized that these weapons were not only terrible, but also threatened by their effects to turn against those who used them, they were no longer used. For example, Hitler did not use chemical weapons when he invaded France, nor did the Allies use them to stop the Germans. Nuclear weapons are similar to chemical weapons in the threat they pose, including to their users. This leads us to conclude in limine that we need to reason about the effect of nuclear weapons for the nations of the early 20th century by considering this effect equivalent to what it is in today's world since the Cold War. In other words, the Wehrmacht wouldn't have had fun launching nuclear weapons at everyone, risking extermination, whereas in our reality they didn't use chemical weapons. In this hypothesis, Franz Ferdinand is also assassinated in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary wants to punish Serbia, Russia defends it, thus defending Serbia, and the Kaiser's Germany defeats Russia. On the other hand, Germany did not declare war on France, with whom it risked nuclear extermination. Consequently, the United Kingdom did not declare war on Germany, nor on Austria-Hungary either. The British and French contented themselves with a total embargo on the Central Empires and eventually worked to undermine the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, the Anglo-French arms industry supported Russian production all the more easily because it did not have to feed a war at home. Although they haven't entered the war, the French and British are massing troops at some distance from the German border to prevent a conventional invasion, forcing the Germans to immobilize troops on their western flank, even to do nothing, just in case it's a Cold War, since that's what happened during the Cold War. Armed and supported by the French and British, Russia is a tougher opponent for Germany than it was in our reality. Germany doesn't dare use its nuclear weapons against a Russia that may not have any, but is still a friend of France and England, whose reaction would be unpredictable. What's more, using nuclear weapons against Russia would diminish Germany's arsenal and thus its deterrent capability against Western enemies. The war thus became bogged down on the Russian front, gradually ruining the economies of the belligerents as losses mounted, while France and England kept their strength intact. After several years, perhaps a little later than in our reality, towards the beginning of the years, the weariness of the populations provokes revolutions in Germany, Russia, and the various national components of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary broke up, and despite a quickly signed peace agreement with the Russian revolutionaries, the German government was unable to quell the protests and was in turn overthrown, just as happened in our own history. The German Empire descended into turmoil and dismemberment. Bavaria seceded, and France stirred up Alsatian separatism. The French and British, fearing the new communist power in Russia, whose alliance was lost, took advantage of the collapse of the Russian and German empires to finance Polish nationalism and the reconstitution of a Polish state through the secession of the two powers. Basically, what I'm saying here is a kind of backward projection of what happened to the USSR, as you'll have gathered, simply because if there had been a Cold War, the results would have been the same, since you know that the USSR collapsed in the same way as the German Empire. So if you put nuclear weapons in at the time, you can see very quickly that it would have had the same result as the Cold War. In a Germany humiliated by its own implosion, outraged by its undermining, and supported with varying degrees of discretion by the British and French, France integrating the secessionist Alsace into a partnership combining customs union and military alliance. Since Germany had a nuclear weapon, France couldn't have simply annexed Alsace-Lorraine, and of course in that case she would have done just that. So I take Adolf Hitler or someone else, but I don't see any point in changing that, rekindles the pan-Germanist streak, launches a war to reconquer Bavaria, which raises French-English protests, but no other reactions. Then came the Spanish War, in which Hitler financed the nationalist camp and engaged in indirect warfare with Stalin. In France and England, Hitler finances and supports Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union of Fascists. Fascist propaganda accusing Western governments of allowing communists to flourish, just as Putinist propaganda today accuses European governments of favoring Islamism. The French Popular Front is particularly vilified. Putinist propaganda accuses European governments of favoring Islamism, and in particular for the past 2 or 3 years of favoring wokism, which is the new communism in their discussion. But then in 2007, that's when you see that things move fast. In 2007, there was still very little talk of all these issues. As I was saying, the French Popular Front was particularly vilified at the time. Austria was annexed, and Hitler turned his sights on Poland with the intention of restoring German territorial continuity to the slave state of Königsberg. Poland had the disadvantage of having become an ally of France and England, and as such was considered to be under their nuclear umbrella. However, Hitler felt that the French and British would not risk a nuclear war for the sake of Poland alone, dying for Danzig, and decided to attack. the French and British react as they did to the aggression of their Russian ally in 2007, massing troops at the border and adopting a total embargo against Germany, but not declaring war. You'll note that, so there too, you'll note that this is ultimately what we did about the war in Ukraine, so the calculation wasn't wrong, but they're not declaring war, so I'll repeat. The reader will note that this hypothesis is not gratuitous, since close to what the two powers did in our reality. If they did declare war, it was only a funny war, with little or no fighting, while Poland was butchered. In the presence of nuclear weapons and even the risk of atomic annihilation, a fortiori, the same would have been true. At this stage, we're in the equivalent of the Russian invasion of the Baltic States with this conventional face-to-face confrontation without direct combat. So, you'll note that, in the end, once again, this has to be transposed to the Ukraine, but that's what's happening. Let me continue. This is where our thought experiment gets more interesting. Let's leap forward in time to anticipate the continuation and end of the war beyond the Western Front. Hitler, assured of a static situation in the West, will be able to launch an invasion of Stalin's Russia, which then has no nuclear weapons, but once again receives British-French support, just as it did in our reality. The immensity and ideological determination of the Russians, together with the material support of the French and British, led to a further collapse of Germany, resulting in a post-war situation relatively similar to the one we have known, with the possible exception of the role of the USA. Quite simply, to put it another way, supported by Western industrial production, Stalin's Russia would have conventionally repelled Hitler's Germany, which would not have dared to carry out massive nuclear strikes on the USSR for fear that France and the United Kingdom would themselves tip over into nuclear war and we'd be on the brink of extermination. So, let me continue. Let's return to the war of movement on the Western Front. Is it possible to envisage a scenario that would take Hitler all the way to Paris? If so, we have a scenario that could take Putin to Berlin. This brings us to the heart of the matter. Before Hitler turned to the Soviet Union, whose attack he needn't have feared since he himself had nuclear weapons while Stalin didn't, he would have tried to advance his pawns, as he did in our reality, into Scandinavia, the Netherlands and Belgium. In our scenario, these states were neutral or allied to the French and British, and if the latter had launched the same conventional actions to defend these states as they did in our reality, they would probably not have played the nuclear escalation game. As in our reality then, the Germans would have seized Denmark, Norway and the Netherlands and penetrated Belgium and Luxembourg and no doubt Alsace too, which as we said would have become independent. In these peripheral zones, conventional confrontations could have taken place without yet provoking a nuclear escalation, precisely because they are peripheral zones. And since the main part of the Battle of France, which led to the collapse of the French army, took place in Belgium, this battle would have taken place within a few details. Now that's important. Take a look at the map I'm displaying here, which shows the Battle of France. You'll see that within the framework of the essential, at least decisive Battle of France, because after the Battle of France it's also the invasion of the rest of the country. But if you look at all of those we're talking about, i.e. the breakthrough at Sedan, Montcornet with General de Gaulle, and then the encirclement of Dunkirk. The penetration inside the French frontier was a few dozen kilometers. It wasn't very important. Most of it then was less than 100 kilometers inland, so it's still a small amount. Most of it was in Belgium, and half of the French forces we were located within the territory of Belgium, situated to the west of Brussels. Let me continue. We would then have seen a similar encirclement of the French army at the northern tip of the country, even on Belgian territory, and the equivalent of a Dunkirk encirclement. The road to Paris, as it was in reality, would have been open, and it's here that we're obliged to note a discrepancy. Hitler would not have been able to send his troops to invade the whole of northern France because this existential threat to the Republic would have justified the use of nuclear weapons, useful for sanctuarizing the territory, as in reality, the result would have been a shattered Franco-British army, having lost a huge proportion of its conventional equipment and a mass of Allied prisoners in German hands. But the Germans would have had to halt their offensive at the Franco-Belgian border, or a few kilometers inland from France, to avoid a nuclear escalation, and Paris would not have fallen. From this point on, however, we can explore two different yet plausible scenarios. Either the situation would have remained as it was, and Hitler, using his French and British hostages, would have been able to limit the support of the two powers for Soviet Russia, making the war longer and more painful in the east. or the disaster in Belgium could have provoked a pro-fascist coup d'etat in France, resulting in a kind of Vichy regime, but without the German occupation. The war would have resumed in another form via a civil war in France, with the pro-fascists supported, perhaps discreetly equipped and backed by troops from Hitler, and the Democrats supported by the British Empire. In both cases, the war would have ended as mentioned above, i.e. with the collapse of the German army in Russia, which would have eventually retreated, including from French territory, because in France too, they would have been pushed back by the partisans. But in the second case, then it's likely that America could have had a role to play in the French collapse, in particular by providing logistical support from England. I think this scenario was quite clearly mentioned. We could perhaps add that in the end, the situation of the Vichy quasi-regime, which would have had nuclear weapons to protect the territory in spite of everything, with a kind of civil war, would have been a war by proxy in the end between Germany and England. Let me continue. Back to today's world. I believe that this little thought experiment is rich in lessons and allows us to envisage with greater clarity the possibility, and what it would consist of a war of movements in Europe. Significant movements will be possible, albeit below the threshold of nuclear escalation. The seizure of the Baltic states, as already mentioned, but also a deployment of forces in the Baltic and possible conventional operations against the forces brought back by Nato and massed in Poland opposite the Suwalki corridor. These movements correspond respectively to Hitler's invasion in our scenario of Norway and Denmark on the one hand, and the conduct of conventional fighting against the French and British in the Benelux on the other. The fighting in Poland could lead to the encirclement mentioned as number 2 in the map, reproduced at the beginning of my reasoning, since we have seen that in our alternative scenario, the encirclement of Dunkirk or something close to it could have taken place. It's stage 3 that wouldn't have happened, or not really, the capture of Paris in our alternative scenario, and in our current forecasts, the capture of Berlin, too firmly covered by the American nuclear umbrella. On the other hand, we can envisage that the at least partial fall of Poland and the hostage-taking of NATO forces by a Russian encirclement in this country would complicate the continuation of the war. NATO countries would want to negotiate, and the Kremlin's propaganda machine could cause unrest, particularly in Germany, especially the former GDR. The territory of the European Union, and Germany in particular, could then become the stage for large-scale hybrid warfare by proxy factions. All this being compatible with the state of nuclear forces in Europe today, that makes for a significant quantity of wars of movement remaining below the threshold of nuclear escalation, and we can therefore resolve our paradox and rule out the idea of non-war. So the conclusion, quite simply, was the fact that the war of movement would take place to some extent, and that it would have similar consequences, and that's what I'm telling you with this article in mind. That's what I've been telling you since I took over these broadcasts a year or so ago, and that's why I'm evoking a form of vicalization of Germany, which would probably psychologically collapse if NATO forces were defeated in a conventional conflict in Eastern Europe. Now, we've seen that a certain number of things have happened in Ukraine which establish that the players in the conflict have reacted as I could have envisaged in this article. So on the psychology of the leaders, there was no problem. The conclusions were relevant. So it suggests that the final conclusion is relevant should Russia ever be able to win a major conventional success against NATO in Eastern Europe. And that, of course, is the big question, since Russia's performance so far in Ukraine has not been magical. And so the big question is whether, thanks to mobilization and a mass effect, Russia could eventually succeed in either retaking control of Ukraine or invading the Netherlands. Both, the idea that it could then surround and destroy a NATO rapid reaction force in Poland like Dunkirk, is admittedly more dubious in the current state of affairs. But let's face it, the situation could change in a year's time. We don't know whether Russia's mobilized war economy will have succeeded in rebuilding part of its offensive capacity, or whether Russia will have won an industrial victory over the West, which will find it hard to replenish its stocks, especially if we're forced to commit forces elsewhere, which has problems with China, all that. Well, all those are questions that are incidental to all that, if you like, because they will condition the fact that this success happens. But that wasn't the point of this article. The point of this article was to determine, at least in theory, If Russia is capable of achieving its conventional successes, to what extent is a war of movement permissible without the outbreak of nuclear war? And here I think I've correctly demonstrated that, in theory, if the Russian army were conventionally capable of beating NATO in the Baltic and Polish space, then it would be perfectly capable of reaching Berlin despite the nuclear weapon. So I'm not saying that the Russian army today is militarily capable of doing this conventionally. I'm saying that the existence of nuclear weapons makes it impossible to prohibit it, and that the mere idea that NATO would retaliate in a nuclear way by a conventional invention from the Baltic countries and Poland, for the reasons I explained there, is in my opinion to be ruled out, as these countries are under the NATO nuclear umbrella. This means that the United States would retaliate with nuclear weapons if these countries were hit with nuclear weapons, but the United States would not retaliate with nuclear weapons, or would probably not use tactical nuclear weapons to stop a Russian invasion of these countries, not least because tactical nuclear weapons would have to be dropped on these countries to stop the invaders, so they wouldn't do it. The attempt would be to take back the land conventionally, and all this can happen without the use of nuclear weapons, since nuclear weapons are essentially used to dissuade others from using them. As I was explaining to you, since it's an idea I often mention, I wanted you to have in mind exactly what I said and wrote about it, and so that was the point of this video, and I won't keep you any longer. Thank you for your attention, and put a blue thumb if it interested you, or leave me a comment. See you soon.